Have you ever felt watched even when no one was around? A feeling so subtle it lingers at the edge of your senses. The kind that makes the hairs on your neck rise, though logic tells you you're alone. For Sarah, it was supposed to be a quiet weekend. After an argument with her parents, she insisted she was old enough to stay home by herself. They believed her, and so she stayed behind, in the house she thought she knew so well. The first night passed like any other, empty and uneventful. But then it appeared a note, just a single line, written in an uneven hand. "I'm watching you." It was left on the kitchen counter, a place no one could have reached. At first, she laughed it off, a joke, perhaps left behind by her little brother before he left with their parents. A prank, a way to get under her skin. But pranks don't feel like this. There was something about the note, something strange in its presence, something heavy in its simplicity. And this was only the beginning. By the next night, the notes started to appear where they couldn't possibly be. Inside her locked bedroom, on the mirror, traced faintly into the fog after her shower, even within the cold, sealed confines of her refrigerator. Every time, the same message, "I'm watching you." Sarah wasn't sure what frightened her more, the notes themselves or the thought that someone, somewhere, was close enough to leave them, close enough to see her, hear her, and perhaps even touch her without her knowing. This isn't a story about a fleeting moment of fear. It's about a discovery, a realization that whatever was happening wasn't random. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate, calculated, and chillingly personal. By the time she realized the truth, it was too late to stop it. Because sometimes, what we fear most isn't what we see, but what we fail to notice. The small details. The doors we thought were closed, but weren't. The objects slightly out of place. The tiny, almost imperceptible ways our reality begins to shift, one note at a time. Sarah's story isn't one of imagination or coincidence. It's a story of survival, of courage, and of the terrifying knowledge that some things, once set in motion, cannot be undone. This is her story. Her name was Sarah, and she was like any other teenager, eager for a bit of freedom. The kind of freedom that only comes when your parents leave town for a few days, leaving you behind to manage things on your own. The argument had been a small one, typical for someone her age, over the usual things, curfews, chores, and whether or not she was mature enough to handle a few nights alone. But in the heat of the moment, Sarah had insisted she could manage just fine, that she was old enough to make her own decisions. Her parents had hesitated, but ultimately they'd relented, reminding her to lock up and take care of herself. And with that, they were gone, leaving Sarah to enjoy her weekend of solitude. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills the air like a heavy blanket. It wasn't a large house, one of those suburban homes tucked away on a quiet street. A few trees stood sentinel outside, their bare branches casting long shadows across the front yard. Inside it was cozy, comfortable, nothing that would suggest anything could go wrong. It was a place Sarah knew inside and out. Nothing ever happened here. Nothing except for the quiet. She texted a few friends, settled onto the couch, and put on a movie, enjoying the peace and quiet that only comes when you're home alone. There was a sense of comfort in being by yourself, especially after the tension of the argument. No parents, no rules, just time to breathe. She had the house to herself, with only the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of cars passing outside. The night drifted on uneventfully. A few quiet hours passed, but Sarah couldn't shake the odd sense of unease that seemed to follow her through the house. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint, not at first. Just a lingering feeling, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder for no reason at all. A faint creak echoed from upstairs. She paused the movie and listened. Nothing. The house was still. But the creak, where had it come from? She shrugged it off and turned the lights down lower, trying to focus on the movie again. But there it was again. The lights flickered just once, and then returned to their steady glow. She told herself it was the wind outside, or maybe a loose wire. But then came the shadow, a fleeting movement in the corner of her eye, so fast she couldn't be sure she'd seen it at all. She turned sharply toward the source of the movement, but the room was empty. The quiet house settled back into its rhythm. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It felt as if the silence had weight, as if something else was listening. She took a deep breath, shook off the strange sensation, and went back to her phone, texting a friend to break the silence. "Everything okay?" the message read. A few moments later, a reply came back, "Yeah, just hanging out. What about you?" The casual exchange helped to ease the tension. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. But then, as she wandered into the kitchen for a drink, she saw it. The note. It was sitting on the counter, placed in the middle of the otherwise empty space, just sitting there in plain sight. It read, "I'm watching you." Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, staring at the note, unsure if her eyes were deceiving her. It wasn't hers. She hadn't written it. And there was no one else in the house, at least that she knew of. She thought back to her brother. He'd been playing pranks on her before, but he'd left for a few days with their parents. There was no way he could have come back without her noticing. But this was different. The handwriting was messy, crude, not the neat scribble of someone her age. It was unsettling in its simplicity. The words weren't threatening, but their meaning was clear. Someone was watching. Still, Sarah brushed it off as a prank, maybe a leftover joke from her brother, or perhaps even something her parents had left behind. It had to be a prank. She picked up the note and tossed it into the trash, but the feeling that something wasn't right lingered in the pit of her stomach. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. With a dismissive shake of her head, Sarah returned to the living room, determined to finish her movie. The quiet, however, had taken on a new tone. It no longer felt peaceful. It felt oppressive. The hours passed in a blur, but the unease never left. Each sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified, creaks from the floors, the occasional rattle of a window. But Sarah wasn't one to be easily spooked. She'd convince herself that everything was fine. After all, she had the whole house to herself. No one was there, or so she thought. It had been a quiet night, the kind Sarah had hoped for when she'd first been left alone. The kind where you could sink into the comfort of your own space, free from the constant hum of conversation and the expectations of others. She'd locked all the doors and windows, just like her parents had instructed her to do before they left. It was, after all, a simple precaution. Who would ever have expected that anything could go wrong in a quiet suburban neighborhood? But as she lay in bed that night, something gnawed at her, something she couldn't place. The house was too quiet, too still. She pulled the covers tighter around her, her eyes scanning the room as the dim light from the night lamp cast long shadows on the walls. The air felt heavier now, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Her eyes fluttered closed, but sleep wouldn't come. There was something about the stillness that didn't sit right. And then, when she finally dared to shut her eyes and try to drift into sleep, there it was. A soft sound, a whisper in the dark, a rustling, faint but undeniable. She jolted upright in bed, heart pounding. She waited, listening. It was silent again, but then her eyes fell upon it. Another note. This one wasn't on the kitchen counter or hidden in the fridge. This one was in her locked bedroom, right there on her nightstand. It was simple. "I'm still watching." Her pulse quickened, her breathing shallow. There was no mistaking it. This note hadn't been there earlier. She was certain of it. She had locked every door and window before climbing into bed. No one could have come in. But the note, this note, was now in plain sight, as though it had appeared out of nowhere. Her mind raced. Could she have missed it? No, it was impossible. Her bedroom door had been locked, the windows shut tight. No one could have gotten inside. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she stared at the words on the paper. She hadn't heard anyone move, hadn't seen any signs of intrusion. And yet, there it was. The house seemed to press in on her, the silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. A cold chill swept across the room, making her shiver involuntarily. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She shook her head, trying to dispel the rising panic. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," she told herself. "You're tired. You're just imagining things." But as she glanced around her room, she noticed something else. The dresser, which had been pushed against the wall just hours ago, was now slightly askew. The nightstand was a few inches further from the bed than she remembered, and the closet door, she was sure she had closed it, was now standing ajar. No, she had locked everything. She had checked it all before going to bed. No one could have gotten in. Her breathing grew more shallow, and her thoughts scrambled for some logical explanation, some way to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't, and she didn't want to believe the alternative, that someone or something was inside her home. And then came the sound, a faint scratching. At first, it was so soft she wasn't sure if she'd heard it, but it grew louder, more insistent, as though something or someone was trying to claw its way through the attic. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She slowly slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to leave, to do anything but stay. But she stayed. She crept toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. The scratching grew louder, the sound of nails dragging against wood sending a shiver down her spine. She pushed open the door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The hallway was still. The house was still. But the attic door, tucked away at the end of the hall, was slightly ajar. She'd closed it earlier. She was certain of it. Every inch of her screamed for her to leave, to run. But Sarah's feet remained frozen to the floor. She stood there, staring at the attic door, the scratching now turning into a rhythmic tapping, as though someone or something was waiting for her to come closer. But no, she wouldn't. She couldn't. She had to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the house was old, that the wind could have moved the furniture, that the attic was just full of dust, and the scratching was just the house settling. "It's just the house," she whispered under her breath. "It's just the house." But as the minutes passed, the unease grew harder to dismiss. The house was too quiet, too still, and yet she was sure there was something moving behind those closed doors, waiting, watching, waiting for her to make the first move. And then, without thinking, she found herself walking toward the attic door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. It felt cold, colder than it should have been. As she twisted the knob, the door creaked open, revealing the darkened staircase leading upward. But there was nothing there, nothing but the darkness. And still, that cold, gnawing feeling remained. She shut the door quickly, heart racing, mind scrambling to hold on to reason. There was no one there. There couldn't have been. She had locked every door. She had checked everything. But as she walked back toward her room, her eyes landed on one final detail. The note. The note she had dismissed earlier. The one that had appeared without warning. Hadn't she thrown it away? But now it was sitting neatly on her pillow. "You can't hide from me." By the third night, Sarah was no longer questioning the oddities. She was dreading them. The house, her once safe sanctuary, had become a place she no longer recognized. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sent a shiver of terror down her spine. But it wasn't the house that had changed. It was her, and with each passing moment, she could feel the walls closing in. That night, she woke to something different. It was the bathroom mirror. She didn't notice it immediately. The soft fog clinging to the edges of the mirror, the dull reflection of the bathroom light. She rubbed her eyes, pushing away the last vestiges of sleep. But then it caught her attention. The writing. "I'm closer than you think." The words scrawled across the mirror, as though they'd been written by an invisible hand, burned into her mind. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her heart thundered in her chest. This was different. The notes had never been this direct before. She froze, staring at the glass, but the condensation remained. No handprints, no smudges, just the message, unmistakable and chilling. It was then that something else dawned on her. The notes couldn't have come from someone outside the house. There was no way anyone could have gotten in, not with the windows locked and the doors bolted. She hadn't heard a thing, and she was sure, absolutely sure, that she was alone when the notes first appeared. But this note was different. She wasn't alone. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. It was time to call her parents. They would help. They would know what to do. They would reassure her that everything was fine, that it was just her imagination. But as she dialed, her thoughts raced ahead. What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm overreacting again? Her mother picked up after the first ring, her voice warm, soothing, distant. "Sarah, sweetie, everything is fine. I'm sure you're just overthinking things. You're probably just stressed from the fight. Take a deep breath and relax." Sarah's heart sank. She couldn't understand. How could they not see it? How could they not hear the scraping from the attic, the movement in the halls? "Mom, please. I'm scared. There's something happening here." Her mother's voice softened, but the doubt was clear. "Sarah, honey, we're far away, and we can't help if you keep panicking. You've got to stay calm. Everything is fine." The call ended, and Sarah was left standing in the middle of the bathroom, feeling more alone than she had in her entire life. But it didn't stop there. The movement in the attic had started again. A soft rustling, a scuffling sound like something or someone was shuffling around, moving objects, shifting things in the dark. Sarah's pulse quickened, her instinct screaming at her to stay away from that attic door. But she had to know. She had to understand. With one last deep breath, she grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen. The beam of light flickered nervously as she made her way toward the attic door. The house was still, too still, and the sound from above was louder now, unmistakable. The thud of something heavy being dropped, the scrape of a chair being pushed across the floor. She reached for the attic handle, her fingers slick with sweat. With a single twist, the door creaked open. The attic was dark, almost suffocating in its silence. But the light from her flashlight pierced through the gloom, catching on something that didn't belong. It wasn't just the remnants of an abandoned space. It wasn't just dust and cobwebs. It was evidence. Sarah stepped into the attic, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. The smell of stale air filled her nostrils, mixed with something sour decay. At first, she thought it was the remains of old food, but as she scanned the space, her eyes landed on something else. Old food wrappers, crumpled cans, and beneath the pile of discarded items, a thin, worn blanket, a crumpled pillow. Her throat tightened. The realization hit her like a brick. Someone had been living here. For how long? Her flashlight hovered over the space, her heart racing with every second. But that wasn't the worst part. Scattered throughout the attic, tucked away in odd corners, were more notes. And this time, they weren't written in her handwriting. The letters were different. The strokes were sharp, almost jagged, and the ink smeared in places as though the writer had been in a hurry. I know you're here. You'll never leave. Don't think I won't find you. Her stomach twisted into a knot. Sarah's hand trembled as she picked up one of the notes, the cold paper seeming to burn in her palm. She could feel her breath catch, her chest tightening as though the air around her had thickened. She couldn't stay here. Someone had been hiding in her house, someone who knew her every move, every fear. And the realization crushed her. The walls, the doors, the locked windows, they had all meant nothing. Whoever was watching her had been here all along. But it wasn't just about the notes. The attic wasn't just a hiding spot. It was the place where everything was controlled, where someone had been watching her, waiting. And now that she had found the evidence, she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer in control. The attic had revealed more than Sarah could bear. The discovery of the hidden space, the blanket, the food wrappers, and the unsettling notes had shattered her sense of security. She thought she had prepared for everything, locking the doors, securing the windows, and even calling for help. But she hadn't accounted for the most terrifying possibility of all. Someone had been watching her this entire time. She wasn't alone. She never had been. The house, once familiar and comforting, was now something unrecognizable. The walls seemed to close in on her as she stood there, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her hands, casting long shadows that danced around her like living things. Each crack of the floorboards beneath her feet was a reminder that she was being watched. She needed help. She needed to get out. But the phone, in her panic, Sarah rushed back to the bedroom, her heart racing, each beat louder than the last. The silence of the house pressed in around her, suffocating her. She grabbed her phone, her fingers moving frantically to unlock it. She had charged it just before bed, and the battery should have been full. But as the screen flickered to life, her stomach dropped. The battery icon showed a faint red warning. 0%. Impossible. She'd barely used it. Her hand shook as she pressed the power button again, praying it was some sort of glitch. But nothing. The screen remained dark. A cold chill ran through her as the silence of the room pressed heavier on her chest. Frantic, she dashed to the hallway, hoping for any sign of life, any voice that could break the stillness. She ran to the landline, the old-fashioned phone sitting quietly on the kitchen counter, a comforting relic from a time before cell phones. She dialed her parents' number, the numbers pressing under her fingers with a sense of urgency. But no dial tone. Her fingers froze. The line was dead. Her heart pounded in her ears as she tried again. The phone remained silent. This wasn't just bad luck. This was deliberate. Someone had cut the lines. A scream built in her throat, but she swallowed it down. It was all too much. How could this be happening? How was she so utterly isolated, unable to reach anyone? She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her helplessness. Her mind raced, spiraling into worst-case scenarios. But before she could process them fully, something in the darkness shifted. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, echoed through the house. A soft creak, followed by a muffled sound. Someone or something was moving again. She could hear the steps now, deliberate, as if someone was slowly walking through the halls just beyond her reach. She wasn't imagining it. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a rhythmic tread that came closer. The thumping of her own heart nearly drowned out the sound. Her breath was shallow as she crept toward the sound, her pulse hammering against her ribcage. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the house, but the door, the windows, none of them were safe. She had no escape. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Her fingers found the doorframe of the living room, her grip tightening until her knuckles were white. She stepped slowly, inch by inch, praying for some sign of what was waiting for her. But nothing prepared her for what came next. A voice. Low. Soft. "You're not going anywhere." The words sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She froze. The voice wasn't from the halls. It came from inside the house, right beside her. But there was no one there. No shadow. No figure. Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But the silence was all that answered. She slowly turned, her eyes scanning the room as if hoping to catch a glimpse of the person who had spoken. The house felt smaller now, its walls closing in on her as she listened for any movement. Her breath quickened as she backed away, her mind swirling with fear. "I'm here, Sarah," the voice continued, almost whispering directly into her ear. She spun around, her heart slamming against her chest. There was nothing behind her. No figure, no presence. Just the oppressive silence that had become all too familiar. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the door handle. She needed to get out. She couldn't stay here. But as she touched the handle, the door, it wouldn't open. The door was locked. Her hand was shaking as she yanked it again and again, but the latch didn't budge. She was trapped. She looked around frantically. Every exit, every possible escape route was sealed. No phone, no way to communicate. The house had turned against her. A cold gust of air swept through the room, sending a chill down her spine. The windows were closed. The door was locked. Yet somehow, the air felt wrong. A sudden realization hit her. Whoever had been hiding in the attic, whoever had been leaving those notes, wasn't just playing some twisted game. They were waiting for something. They were waiting for her to break. And now, she was alone in the dark, with no one to help her. Not even her own thoughts could offer her a way out. The darkness had consumed the house, the once familiar place, now a prison. The voice spoke again, barely audible but unmistakable. "It's too late now, Sarah. You're mine." The house was silent again, but the silence, this time, was a warning. Sarah could feel it. The oppressive stillness had taken on a weight of its own. She locked herself in her room, her back pressed against the door, heart hammering in her chest as she tried to steady her breath. But every sound, the faint creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle from the hallway, told her something was coming closer. She didn't know how much longer she could stay in that room. Her mind was unraveling, the walls closing in around her. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere left to run. The idea of waiting, of hiding, had grown unbearable. The quiet was suffocating. The minutes stretched into hours and still nothing. Then, a sound she couldn't ignore. A slow, deliberate tap. 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 Footsteps. They were getting closer. She swallowed, trying to force air into her lungs as panic surged within her. The door felt like it was closing in on her. She wasn't safe. She hadn't been safe for a long time. Who was doing this to her? She stared at the door, her eyes wide, listening, hoping for some sign that this was all just in her mind. But then a slip of paper slid under the crack at the bottom of the door. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. With shaking hands, she bent down and grabbed the note. She could barely read the words through her blurred vision. "Open the door, Sarah." The words were simple, but they felt like a command, as if whoever had been haunting her knew exactly what she would do next. She gripped the note tightly, her knuckles white, and slowly stood up. Should she open it? Everything in her screamed to run, to find a way out. But she had to face this. She had to confront it. She wasn't going to wait anymore, trapped in the room like a prisoner. She had no choice. Her mind was fractured, the fear twisting her thoughts. But there was one thing she knew for certain. If she didn't act now, she would never have the chance to. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. A cold sweat broke out across her skin, and her stomach turned. What if it was all a trap? What if the person, the thing, was waiting for her on the other side, just beyond the door? What would happen when she opened it? With one swift motion, she turned the knob and flung the door open, her eyes scanning the hallway. Empty. There was nothing there. No one. No shadow. No figure. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped out, her pulse racing, each footstep echoing through the house like a distant drumbeat. Her breathing was shallow, her legs unsteady beneath her. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She stepped further into the hallway, her senses heightened, every creak of the house making her jump. She looked around, but all she saw were empty rooms. The walls, once so familiar, now seemed foreign. The corners of the house shadowed in a way she couldn't explain. The house felt wrong. She stepped forward, the air cold against her skin, when something caught her eye. A faint movement from the corner of her vision. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned her head, eyes locking onto the attic hatch at the far end of the hallway. The hatch was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that before. She had checked it, locked it. Hadn't she? The shadow. She saw it then, fleeting but unmistakable. A dark figure, just beyond the edge of the hatch, watching her. Sarah froze, her entire body going rigid. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It was as if it were waiting, watching her every move. Her heart raced, the panic surging once more, her mind screaming for her to run, to leave. But her body refused to obey. Her eyes locked on the hatch, the figure just out of reach, its presence suffocating. The door had been empty. The house had been silent. But now it was clear. Sarah had never been alone. Not for 1 second. And just as she was about to turn and flee, a voice broke the silence. It was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through her like ice. "I've been here the whole time." Sarah's story, the one we thought we knew, ended that night. Or so it seemed. But as we watch, as we try to make sense of what happened to her, one question lingers in the shadows. What if it's not over? The house was still. Too still. Sarah's breaths came shallow. A sound so fragile in the heavy air that it seemed like the walls themselves might hear her. She stood in the dim hallway, the pulse in her ears growing louder with every passing second, almost drowning out the sharpness of her fear. The house felt different, cold, hostile, and alive with something that didn't belong. But she was no longer sure what was real, or who was watching. The attic hatch was open just enough for a shadow to spill out, like a dark stain soaking into the fabric of the night. The faint flicker of light from above seemed to draw the shadows downward, stretching them across the hallway floor, creeping like an insidious force that knew her every step. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, like a hidden force pushing against her mind, urging her to remember something crucial. But she couldn't quite grasp it. Her heart hammered in her chest. Was someone up there? No, it couldn't be. The attic was supposed to be empty. She was supposed to be alone. Was she, though? Sarah forced herself to take a step forward, her legs shaking beneath her. It was like walking into a trap. Every step she took felt like it echoed through the silence, louder than the one before. The oppressive stillness clawed at her, thick and heavy, making it harder to breathe. And then it happened. A sound, barely perceptible but undeniable. A faint scrape against the walls above, a low murmur that she could almost convince herself was her imagination. Almost. But this was different. It was the sound of someone or something waiting. The breath in her throat caught. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Everything in her body screamed for her to run, to escape this house that had once felt like home. But her feet refused to obey. Instead, she stood frozen, unable to tear her gaze from the attic hatch that had now opened wider, as if inviting her into the dark. And then the air seemed to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, a chill so sharp it pricked her skin. She rubbed her arms, trying to warm herself, but it was no use. She was being watched. She could feel it, the weight of eyes on her. She wasn't alone. The light flickered again, more urgently now, casting erratic shadows that danced across the floor. It was almost as if something or someone was moving up there just beyond the beam of the dim light. A shape, a figure, a movement that was there one moment and gone the next. Was that a figure in the corner of the attic? Or was she losing her mind? But no matter how hard she stared, no matter how much she tried to convince herself that it was just a trick of the light, the feeling of presence, of something there, watching her, grew stronger. Her chest tightened. Her eyes darted around the room. She knew she couldn't escape now. There was no way out. The house had closed in on her. It had been waiting, and it wasn't finished with her. The scratching sound from the attic returned, louder this time. The frantic movement above. Was it someone trying to reach her? Was it the thing that had left the notes? The thought hit her like a cold slap. Someone had been here before. Someone had been here all along, moving through her home without her knowing, without her seeing. And then it hit her like a tidal wave. The notes she had dismissed. The ones that had been left in impossible places, on her bathroom mirror, on the locked bedroom door, on the inside of the refrigerator. The presence in the house wasn't new. It had always been here just beneath the surface, quietly slipping in when she wasn't looking. She'd backed away from the attic hatch, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The light flickered again, illuminating a dark corner. For a split second, she saw it, a figure, tall, thin, standing motionless in the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. But as the light dimmed, the figure disappeared, just like everything else that had haunted her, vanished into the dark, as if it had never been there at all. Could it have been real? Was it? The silence felt suffocating. And then, just as Sarah turned to escape, there it was. The final note. A single piece of paper slipped under her bedroom door. She hesitated, too terrified to move, but her hand reached for it against her will. She unfolded it, reading the chilling words written in a shaky hand. "Open the door, Sarah. Open the door." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her hand trembled as she held the note, but she knew there was no escaping it now. She had to face whatever, or whoever, was in her house. There was no more running. Sarah gathered every ounce of courage she had left and rushed toward the door. Her breath hitched as she slowly turned the handle, opening the door just enough to step out into the hallway. But when she stepped into the empty space, there was no one. Nothing. The house was eerily still. The hallway stretched before her, dark and silent. It was as if the whole world had paused, holding its breath. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining her senses, but nothing moved. She turned, scanning the room in disbelief. The house was quiet again, too quiet. But then, just as she thought it was finally over, her eyes caught something. Something moving at the top of the stairs. The attic hatch was open, just slightly, just enough for the faintest flicker of light to spill through. And as Sarah looked up there, in the darkness above, she saw it. The figure. It was standing there, watching her. Sarah's story ended that night, but hers may not be the only one. What about yours? Could you be living with someone you've never seen? Could you be sharing your home with a presence that you can't even begin to understand? Have you ever thought about what could be hiding right beneath your nose? About the things that never reveal themselves until it's too late. The truth is, you might never know. Not unless you pay close enough attention to the things you can't explain. So, what's watching you right now? And can you even trust your own eyes to tell you the truth? Now that Sarah's story is over, or is it? What if the presence that haunted her still lingers somewhere in the shadows? What if it's closer than you think, waiting in your own home? Have you ever felt that tinge of paranoia when you're alone? That strange feeling that someone is just behind you, even when you know there's no one there. We want to hear from you. Has something like this ever happened to you? Have you experienced the unnerving sensation of being watched in the most unexpected moments? Don't let your fear be a silent one. Share your stories in the comments below. Let us know what's happened when the lights go out and you're left alone with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, if you felt the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, make sure to subscribe. Turn on notifications, because these stories, they're far from over. Subscribe now and stay alert, because next time it could be you or someone you know. Keep watching.